Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health consultant, and we're going to talk about managing conflict and arguing within relationships. This is going to be so great because all we do is argue. Just kidding. Kind of not kidding. We were literally arguing about something as we were going through the managing conflict notes. Anyways, this is something you brought up because
clearly we worked it out though.
Yeah, we really settled it. I'm so past it. No, but this is a really, really important topic. Mm-hmm. And just so you guys know, when we are coming up with podcast topics, it's kind of like, hey, what's been coming up? What's a theme? And this is something that, you brought up and said, hey, this has kind of been a recurring theme. I don't know if it's like the time of year or if people just, whatever it is. Conflict, though, it's so frustrating because I think a lot of people come at it with different lenses, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's some people who are very non-confrontational, like they don't want any kind of confrontation. They shut down. And then there's some people who's like, they think, oh, I don't like conflict, right? Like I would say, oh, I don't like conflict. But then my threshold is so much higher than other people that like minimal kind of things that I don't think are conflict, I think are just enjoying disagreements that some people are like, why are we arguing right now? I'm like, this isn't an argument. Like, really? I'm like, oh, maybe this is an argument. Okay. So I think every part of what's challenging about conflict, obviously there's certain things that are going to be pretty black and white, but there are other things that it's like that gray area because everybody's like threshold is different, right? Which is obviously part of learning your partner and knowing all that. But anyways, let's get into it.
Yeah. So to just piggyback a little bit off of what you said, for the context of this, I want everybody to assume that they already know when the person is in a conflict with them, okay, right? Yeah. Because I think as you start dating, you gradually learn where the boundaries are, where the limits of the relationship exist, what's going to piss the person off, what's going to create arguments, where the sensitive and vulnerable areas are within the relationship. I mean, that's what dating is. You're learning to integrate two lives together. So for all intents and purposes, we're going to assume you already know where that argument line is.
We might want to do a podcast on the front end of that though, just because a lot of people, I don't think, especially in the beginning, right? Because it is like, you don't want to be like, oh, that really hurt my feelings because you're like, well, I don't want to be like wimpy or whatever. But then like, I'm just saying, like, there's certain times where somebody will say something, you're like, oh, I'll just let that slide. But like, and then a few things happen and then you're like, oh, why the fuck? And you're like, holy wait. Like, and it's just like those
cascades down. Yeah. And so, and I think you bring up a really good point. In the beginning of a relationship, most people are trying to avoid conflict. And there's a lot of reasons for that. People enter into a relationship, and when you first start dating someone, it's oftentimes referred to as the honeymoon phase, right? And you've got these huge flood of dopamine and serotonin, norepinephrine, and all these feel-good neurochemicals in your brain that are telling you, oh my God, this person's amazing. And you see no fault with what they do. And then eventually as the relationship progresses and la la land begins to fade, reality begins to set in. And when reality sets in, all of those feel-good neurochemicals are gone, and so you're left with the reality of this person. And so now you're trying to decide can this person actually love me? Do we get along? Do we have a real connection? Not just, I was interested in them, I was infatuated with them, and once that infatuation kind of fades, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. And so you learn a lot about a person within that space. And once the euphoric phase is gone, this is when conflict management really becomes a critical component in a relationship. And I don't think it has anything to do with the time of the year. I think it has everything to do with the individuals in the relationship, because it's going to happen. And I think if I'm going to start this podcast on a note, it would be that conflict is inevitable. It is going to happen. There is no such thing as a conflict-free relationship. It simply doesn't exist. And I think if you can get rid of the myth that all good relationships don't have conflict, you're going to be better off. And in fact, you can prepare yourself once you recognize that conflict is inevitable, and it's actually a sign of a healthy relationship, and people can grow and prosper, and there's good things that come out of conflict. I think all too often the perception that people have is, oh, we're arguing, we're fighting a lot, so the relationship must be bad. And it's like, actually, no. If you can reframe that and understand that this conflict is actually an opportunity for you guys to grow together and to resolve some things and to work as a team and compromise, you're going to be better off. And so if you recognize that, number one, conflict is inevitable in all relationships, in all good relationships. Okay, so when it happens, I don't have to be taken back by it. I don't have to think, oh my God, and second guess the relationship and wonder, am I making the right choices? Is this the right person for me? And take it down this catastrophic hole. Relax. Pump the brakes. You're two individuals working to combine your lives. So recognize that conflict is in fact going to happen, and there's nothing you can do to escape it. The best thing you can do is develop the skill set to deal with it and manage it with your partner.
I think when people hear the word conflict in a relationship, they're automatically thinking of like an all-out brawl where the couple is like yelling and saying like derogatory things, and that's an end phase that maybe you'd recommend not getting to, but that's not necessarily conflict, right? Like that is a type of conflict, but that's not like what we're discussing here. You know what I mean? Like this isn't immediately something that's like awful, like code red, like everything is falling apart, like people are losing their minds, slamming doors. Like that's not usually how things start. And I would say that, yeah, like you're going to have conflict, and that probably means that you're actually discussing things in a better way. Like, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like if people don't have any kind of conflict, they maybe aren't communicating, because usually one person's going to be like, oh, okay. Yeah. You know, and then it's like the chances of two people not having anything that there's going to be conflict over is probably slim to fucking zero. Like even if you're the most compatible people. So usually in my interpretation, that would probably mean that somebody is just not bringing up what maybe they're upset about or what. And then that's going to be a very like avoidant type behavior. And then you're like, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And then eventually that's when it is that blow up. Like, well, you said these 3 things and it really bothered me. And it's like, well, if we would have just addressed this earlier. And
therein lies some of the problem. If you're not expressing things as they're developing or evolving within the relationship, and you're letting it stockpile. And so you're essentially like getting to this overflow point. And then once you hit the overflow point, everything starts coming down. Well, part of conflict management means addressing those things before they get to that level. And the other thing I want to comment on is if the only way for you to express conflict or arguments within the relationship is for you guys to lose your shit and scream and yell and throw things and call each other names, this isn't even about conflict management. Like this is taken to a whole nother level of, we need to work on how you guys actually communicate your needs and wants and frustrations with each other. It's totally unhealthy and inappropriate to express your emotions that way, to scream at somebody, to lose your temper with them. Don't get me wrong. We all get angry, and there's always moments and times in people's lives where they say things they wish they could take back and regret. I'm not talking about that. We can all forgive somebody for certain things, but there are dynamics that play out when you're arguing with somebody that if those types of dynamics exist, your relationship is going to suffer immensely as a result, and all of your relationships in your life are going to suffer.
Yeah, that's no longer is there like a different name for that? Because like I don't want people to misinterpret like conflict for like that, because yes,
I mean some of that borderlines on like verbal abuse.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like that's not what we're talking about. Like I don't want people to hear this and be like, yeah, like conflict's normal. Like we're not trying to normalize that conversation. Certainly that is a type of conflict, but that would be like that's so far past what we're discussing.
Yeah.
Just want to make that clear.
Yes.
In case anybody was like...
We're not talking about violence. We're not talking about abuse. There's clear boundaries around that. And that's the exception, you know, for those rules. It's like...
Or even just really like hard fighting, you know, like slamming doors, screaming. Like that's not like, you know, there are places that you don't have to get there.
Correct.
Like there's a lot of steps before that. Like nobody just walks in the door, yells in your face, and then slams it. Like there's going to be like 12 steps before that. So that's what we're talking about. Like, let's manage those things before it gets to that point.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say to people is, in terms of managing the conflict, is what's the quality and the status of the relationship before the argument? And by the way, I wanted to reference where I'm going to get a lot of this material from for this podcast. I actually want to start doing that more, is kind of giving people more of the references, some of the materials that I use, people that I quote or cite. But a lot of this is coming from the Gottman Institute. John and Julie Gottman are 2 of the most prolific relationship counselors, and they've produced so much material on relationships in general. I highly recommend, if there's any couples out there, they have couples seminars, 2 or 3 day weekend retreats, really great strength-based building stuff to, explore your relationship with and develop healthier habits. So a lot of this material is coming from their work, their guidance. But key fundamentals is, think of it like this. If the quality of my relationship on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being everything is perfect, harmonious, balanced, 10 being like destruction, like relationship is ending. if the relationship is always teetering on the high end of that scale, right? If you're always walking around at like a 7 or an 8 with your partner, when any one small conflict happens, it becomes amplified, right? And there's nowhere to go except to like dangerous explosion. And so to me, it's like, it's not the argument or the conflict that's really the problem in that relationship. The relationship problem is really, where are you guys missing each other? Where's the lack of connection? Where's the friendship? Where's the intimacy and the building and the growing as a couple? How are you guys connecting in all these other areas before this one little conflict occurs, right? Because conflict isn't a constant, and it more than likely isn't a constant in most relationships, because we need a reprieve from it. But if the major majority of the relationship consists of just conflict, I would really like to evaluate that relationship and really understand what it is the two of you are getting out of it. If there's very little friendship building, right? There's no real connection and I don't know, just development of intimacy and closeness within the relationship, of shared experiences in life, if you're just arguing all the time. And so part of it is like, okay, sometimes we need to halt arguing and figure out, like, we don't even need to deal with the conflict. We just need to go back in time and kind of like rework our relationship here. Let's get on the same page. Because if you're not on the same page, then finding a common ground for conflict is going to be really difficult. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
The other thing I want to say is, one of the goals is to make conflict and arguing constructive, right? And what I mean by that is, don't think of arguing as an opportunity for you to tear each other down, but rather it's an opportunity and a guide to better understanding your partner, right? Because when there's a source of pain, it's going to open up avenues for you to understand them in ways that you didn't know before. And this is what it means to love somebody. This is where compromise and understanding start to play a significant role in the relationship. Mm-hmm. And arguing oftentimes is a very selfish endeavor and a very righteous endeavor. Everybody always thinks that when they're arguing, I'm right. And that's the selfishness that comes with it. It's this egocentric thinking that really comes along with, well, I'm right, you're wrong, you're not understanding me, right? And so
you don't understand where I'm coming from.
That's right. It's your fault, not mine.
I've said that way too many times. Because that's what it feels like when you're in a conflict. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, maybe I'm not getting my point across. Somebody must not understand what I'm saying. So it must be because of that, and not anything else. But it's certainly one of those things, like, obviously everything comes back to communication in a relationship, like literally everything. But I really like the point about it being constructive. And I think that this can be constructive. You know, it doesn't always have to be this, like I said in the beginning, like, everybody has this view of it as like, it's always this really negative, drawn out, like blown up thing. And it's like, no, it could be a constructive thing that you guys are having. But what do you think though about what I was trying to get at? And I don't know if there's like a term for that, but like how people have different levels of all that, you know what I mean? Like different levels of what they view as a conflict. Like, how would somebody be able to get around that? Because I think that can also be a really tough thing, because somebody could be saying like, no, I wasn't upset or anything. Like, I wasn't trying to be confrontational. This is kind of where I'm at, you know, but the other person might take it like, right. And
well, and even this is, if you're arguing about what an argument was about, or are we arguing if we're arguing?
Are we arguing? I don't know.
No, not you and I.
Like, is my radar that broken?
Are we arguing about whether or not that was an argument?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we'll get into some of the steps, but
okay.
I think I want to give actionable steps at the end of this to help people manage these situations. And the first thing I would tell you is you're going to need to listen. Listening is the first and most fundamental aspect of being able to understand something, is being able to listen to it. So instead of viewing negative emotions in a relationship as unwelcome, as unwanted, as detrimental, start to recognize that this is an opportunity for you to explore a sense of longing and positive need within the relationship. By understanding somebody else's emotions, their negative emotions, it's an opportunity to better understand your partner. Instead, so you're arguing with somebody, I'm arguing with you, and I can see, or I'm voicing my opinion about something, and I can see that it's making you angry. Most people will turn around and they're going to dig in, and they're going to voice their opinion back, and I'm going to dig in a little bit more, and I'm going to voice my opinion back. Well, neither one of us is really listening to each other. What we're trying to do is convince the other person that I'm right. Right? And so what I'm missing is I said something that made Lauren upset. What made her angry? Right? I'm curious. Like, I said that X, Y, and Z. Like, it clearly offended you or it bothered you. Tell me what it is about that statement that actually bothered you and made you so upset or angry. Like, now what am I doing? I'm actually looking to listen, to gain information and insight into what it is that bothers you. And now maybe we're getting into fundamental differences as people, and we're learning that maybe this isn't the right person, or maybe there's things about my life or my personality or my views or my religious beliefs or political affiliations that might conflict with this person. And how do I start to tamper that so that it doesn't create this conflict within the relationship? But I don't get any of that. I get none of that if all I'm worrying about is proving my point. And if this whole, like, what are the facts? Like, fuck your facts. This isn't about winning an argument. This isn't a debate. And this is the problem. This is where men struggle, is we're always looking for proof. I want the data. I want the fact. Like, rip this down the line for me, okay? And if your facts don't equal my facts, then clearly you're wrong. I'm right. You should yield and move on and realize you're stupid and right and all that other kind of stuff. And I'm the powerful one, or I'm the grand one. Like, no. This is the relationship. This isn't about right and wrong. This is about a better understanding of one another. And so I think if you want a healthier relationship where you can manage and argue in more productive ways, recognizing that their negative emotions present an opportunity for you to better understand them if you're willing to explore it. But you have to back off your ego and recognize that it's better to be in a relationship that works than it's better to be alone and right, or feel right at least.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to agree. I think, I mean, obviously, like you said, there might be some fundamental things that are maybe, you know, what you would call deal breakers in a relationship potentially. But like, aside from those types of things, like, this doesn't necessarily mean that like either of you have to change your opinion or what you believe, but it's more about, like you said, hearing that other person and like, okay, you know, I feel this way, you feel that way. Where's there some common ground? Where do we disagree? Let's like agree to disagree on this if it's not that big of a deal to either of us. And for some people it might be like, nope, this is like, that's a deal breaker. And then, okay, like then you have to decide if I want to either believe or do or not do X, Y, Z, then you kind of move forward. But I do think that there is a point of arguing that like, you can also just be like, all right, like each person is understood. This is where I was coming from. This is where you're coming from. Maybe we still don't agree on this. I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have responded this way, or, but now let's move forward. Because sometimes like people say things and you don't necessarily like, you know, you might take that really personally or be offended by it. And then, you know, you bring it up and the other person's like, well, what do you, like, I just meant this by it. And then you're like, oh, okay, well, hey, could you maybe not say it that way next time? And then if they're actually listening and understanding, then they might not fix it the next time, you know what I mean? But like,
Are they trying?
Is there progress? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Is there like awareness that they are actually listening? Or is it just like, no, you know, then that'll be another flag for you to be like, all right.
Well, and I've said to people before that the words "I'm sorry" without any behavior change is nothing more than manipulation. I can't slap you in the face and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. You forgive me. And then the next day slap you in the face again and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that. Jiu-jitsu. And then slap you in the face again. Right? And keep repeating the same behavior and then expect my apology to mean anything. I'm only apologizing as a way to like mute the situation and just not deal with it. But if there's no behavior change, then all you're doing is attempting to manipulate the person through I'm sorry. The other thing that I want people to recognize, and this is something that helped me or has helped me tremendously in conceptualizing some of this. Every argument that you're having with your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend is nothing more than a conversation you guys should be having at another point in time. So every argument is an indication of every conversation you weren't having or need to have as a couple. And so what does that mean? It means if I'm pissed and you're pissed and we're both stuck in our feelings right now, maybe we need to call a timeout. Maybe we need to put the brakes on this and be like, okay, we're going to wait until our tempers have calmed where we can actually have a conversation about it. And sometimes you can catch this earlier on in the relationship, you know, and sometimes people have used this as a tool to be like, we're arguing about this. We need to have a conversation about it later. So we're going to go to our separate spots. We're going to tone it down. We're going to watch a movie. We're going to agree that we're going to do something as a couple and not deal with this. Even if you're like sitting on the couch, still kind of angry with each other or whatever, like give yourself the time and the space and recognize that this argument is an indication of a conversation we want to have.
Mm-hmm. Okay? It's like, people always talk about you don't make good decisions when you're overly emotional. Mm-hmm. Rarely does anybody do that. It doesn't mean you have to take emotion out of decisions, but being overly emotional and overcome by negative emotions is not going to be like your best look. It's not going to be your best disagreement, right? And again, if the whole point of this is to potentially hear the other person and get your points across, right? Like, hey, this is how I felt. This is how I feel. This is what you said. This is what I interpreted. Like, all of those things are important, mm-hmm. but you're not going to be able to articulate that very well if you're at level fucking 19 out of 10. Right? Like you're just not going to. I don't mm-hmm. care who you are. I don't care how high your throttle is. Like, nobody is being articulate in that sense. You know what I mean? Or in that situation.
You're not listening.
No, and you're not listening. You're mm-hmm. not articulate, and you're certainly not listening. Mm-hmm. You're just like, I have to win. And then that's where, it can just, like you said, these are conversations that do need to be had. It's, and it could be something silly, right? Like, so mm-hmm. maybe it's not always, maybe the conversation is, hey, maybe we argue too much over these silly things. It's not necessarily like you need to have a end all discussion over this, what movie why did you like this movie? Like, mm-hmm. Like that's not necessarily warranted for another discussion potentially, but hey, why did this get us so upset? Oh, it was because this and this happened earlier today. Mm-hmm. I felt like I wasn't being listened. Mm-hmm. You didn't, whatever it is. Like mm-hmm. I wasn't being heard earlier, and then it escalated into this. It had nothing to do with the movie.
It had nothing to do with the movie.
Okay.
Go back to the 6 categories that we've talked about in other podcasts, right? Power and control, respect mm-hmm. and recognition, care and closeness. Which categories did that actually fall into? Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't feel like you were listening to me, so I didn't necessarily feel cared about, whatever. It's like, okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes a lot more sense than you didn't like the reboot of this movie. Okay, like nobody else did either, but we didn't have to almost break up over it. And listen, I'm making light of this, but like I will take shit there sometimes too, because you're like,
you will really, Lauren?
Because I'm so docile and not argumentative at all. But it's funny because there are some people who in my life who would be like, oh yeah, Lauren is always like what I like to call verbal sparring. Mm-hmm. Me and Danielle are like always doing that. You know what I mean? Like it's just fun to us. Like we're not arguing really. We just kind of like. We just mm-hmm. do that, and it's just like it's kind of fun, mm-hmm. And like that's just normal for us. But then like Sam will be like, "Guys, stop arguing! Like you don't need to." And we're like, "We're not arguing, Sam." But like in other situations, if you're around someone who is like way higher than that, or everybody has things that set them off, and that is, to your point, part of like dating and being in a long-term relationship and seeing those things about people, because there are some things that people could say that would literally not bother me at all and mm-hmm. be like, okay, whatever. Yeah. And then there's other things mm-hmm. that are seemingly much smaller that might set me off for a whole variety of other reasons. And the whole point is to figure out, okay, well, why was that so hurtful? Why did that make me upset?
Yeah. And the idea is to not judge it or compare it to what other people view. If I'm mm-hmm. dating this person, I need to understand, I want to understand mm-hmm. this person, not the rest of the world. I just need to understand this individual. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to arguing, one of the things that I hear a lot is you've heard a version of this, right? Well, there's your side, my side, and then there's the truth, mm-hmm. right? And so what I try and tell people is there is no absolute truth. There's 2 sides to every argument, and they're both right. So stop assuming that there's like this absolute truth that you're going to work your way into. There's not. It's just the 2 of you. And really, when you say there's an absolute truth, you're still trying to hint at the fact that you think you're right. Okay? That's the underlying message, right? It might be 70-30, 60-40, 51-49, but I'm still 51, right? I'm a little bit more right than this person. Right. Yeah. And so get rid of the idea, because they're both right. There's an old, what is it? Like an old story or an old joke. There's a therapist.
You're getting like me now, damn.
No, there's a therapist. He's
old adage.
Yes, an old adage. He's bringing in a couple, and he brings the husband in first, and he listens to the husband, and the husband talks about his wife very bitterly for the next 20 minutes, and the therapist says like, "Wow, I've heard everything that you've said, and I completely agree with you. I'm amazed that you still commit to your family, your wife, all these things." And he says, "Great." And so he leaves the room, and then the wife comes in. She sits down, and she complains about her husband for the next 20 or 30 minutes. And he stops her and he says, "I've heard everything that you said. You're so right. everything that you said is accurate. But I still I admire you for staying committed to your family, to your friends, and everything. And the idea of it is they're both right. And the therapist understands that. The therapist isn't trying to pick sides. And essentially what you guys want to become is your own therapist within your own relationship, and to recognize that this person's perception of the problem is just as valid and real as my perception of the problem. And so there is no absolute truth. There's two truths, and they both exist on equal planes. It doesn't matter if you think the person's being irrational or demanding or ridiculous. Again, let's go back to a conversation and try and understand where this is coming from. Is this a trigger from something in the past? Is this underlying trauma? Is this they hate you and they're picking a fight so that they can end the relationship? Like, try and get to it. The only way to understand those things, though, is to have conversations where you're not heightened about it, because both points of view are valid. And, what I want you to also recognize is your thoughts aren't always true. And if you can recognize that just because you think something, it doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it right. That's kind of something that, depending on the context that you're thinking about it, can have multiple applications. And so, just because you interpret a situation one way doesn't necessarily make it what the person's intentions were. And so recognizing that two truths exist at the same time will help you, and stop searching for like this end-all be-all truth to justify what you think.
And that's why addressing it earlier, or just sooner rather than later, like we said, maybe not like at that exact second, but sooner rather than later, instead of things piling on, because then it does become, okay, it was just this one small thing. And then, they did it again, or they said that again, or they said it that way again. And then you're internalizing it like, oh my gosh, this person is like such a monster in this area, or they're acting out this certain way. It's so wrong, or whatever it might be. And like, you've created something so much larger, instead of being like, hey, you said this is how I responded. And then being able to figure out like immediately, because like I said, there is no really right answer here, because how they're responding or what they're saying is coming from their background and their past experiences. And that doesn't mean you have to like it. You know what I mean? Like, they probably don't like how you say things either. So that's part of like that, trying to address that earlier, to be like, hey, this bothered me. Where are you coming from with this? Instead of, and when you bring it up in that way, it's a lot more like, it's not as like disarming, like, oh my gosh, like now we're in this huge fight. You can just be like, hey, like when this came up, like, what did you really mean by that? And this is something that I think, people who struggle with those kind of conversations, it's so hard, because you just want, I'll let it slide. It's fine. They didn't really mean it, or whatever. Right. Like I've always just like, I'll just push it away. It's fine. It's fine. And then eventually it just like blows up, because it's all these small things aren't addressed, and they were small, but then they became really large, and then if you are able to address something quickly, and then you can see, is that person actually attempting to try and make changes? The other person, and you too, like the other person is probably going to like say things to you like, I don't like how you say these things. And you have to be willing to listen to that as well, because you often don't realize your tone or how you say things, and again, we're all guilty of that. We, in our heads, like, we're not trying to be like malicious most of the time. I guess most people, anybody listening to this podcast most likely is not doing that, but it still can come across that way to the other person, especially if they have been in a situation where they haven't addressed things, haven't brought it up. So I don't know, I feel like the earlier to, like, one of the keys here would probably be addressing it as early as possible, within reason, not in the midst of, chaos maybe.
One comment I would have on that is, are you brushing it under the rug to avoid the conflict, or are you brushing it under the rug and telling yourself it doesn't matter because it actually doesn't matter? If it doesn't matter, then it doesn't become anything. Yeah. But what you're really saying is, it matters to me. I just don't know how to express it yet. And I don't feel comfortable expressing it yet. And so what we want to work on is, what safety patterns, what boundaries do we need to start to put in place where you feel safe enough to express those things to your partner or the person that you're with? Because I can't change if I don't know what's happening inside you. And, when you finally reach that tipping point, you're like, I can't believe you said this. And another thing about your mother-in-law, I'm not dealing with that shit either. And all of a sudden,
like, whoa,
you're dealing with like 4, 5, 6 different things that have been happening over the last 3, 4, 6 months, whatever it is. Like, whoa, now I'm feeling attacked, right? And so if we go back,
no one is going to listen.
If we go back to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse too, right? And what we're talking about is that first horseman is coming in, which is criticism. And now I'm being judged. And what happens after you get judged is you get defensive, and you're not listening to each other. Now you're digging in. And so these little things aren't really little. They're significant to you. And when you minimize them and don't express them to me, I can't change or adjust. And in fact, I'm going to continue to do the small shit that pissed you off. Like, you serve no one, including yourself, by minimizing it and being like, I'll just deal with it later, or it's no big deal. If it's no big deal, fine. Or is it no big deal because you just don't want to create conflict? And that's a slightly different problem, right? Okay.
I'll be silent. Yeah.
A good way to help people understand there's two basic types of problems that exist in a relationship, and you can decipher between them. So the first one is a solvable problem. So what is a solvable problem? Chocolate versus vanilla, Lauren. Solvable problems are problems that are mostly situational and that can be resolved pretty quickly. These are house cleaning, duties and chores, how we're going to discipline the kids, where they're going to go to school, sex, in-laws, situations like that. Like, it's all kind of situational. Whereas you might feel one way, I feel another way, but we can reach a common ground, and then there's a solution and we move on. It's not anything that's going to rip us apart. It's nothing that we can't find a solution for, right? The second type of problem is what they call a perceptual problem. And these are, again, Gottman terms. Perceptual problems are basically problems that keep coming back. And so we've seen this in relationships a lot. Like, how many times have you heard, well, we keep arguing about the same thing over and over again? Like, okay, well, that's an indication that you're dealing with a perceptual problem, right? It keeps, or I'm sorry, not perceptual, perpetual problem.
I was like, perceptual problem.
No, perpetual. Sorry.
Okay.
A perpetual problem is a problem that keeps coming back over and over again. And so these are more about fundamental differences between your two personalities and differences in lifestyle, right? So these are slightly more important. These are rooted in what I call more like a belief system and more ingrained aspects of who you are as an individual, which is going to be more difficult to change, right? When I was making the argument about chocolate or vanilla, like, it's like, okay, I can see your point of view, I can see mine, no big deal, and we move on, right? When I go to the ice cream shop, I get you a scoop of chocolate and I get my scoop of vanilla, like, who gives a shit? That's a small problem. But like, if we're trying to decide what religion to raise our child, slightly different problem. If I disagree with the way you express your opinions and your lack of empathy in a relationship, you know what I mean? These are bigger problems. And so they're more perpetual in nature because they keep resurfacing and they keep coming back because we haven't been able to find common ground to stand on. So usually the result of perpetual problems is it creates gridlock. And gridlock essentially is when both people feel criticized, both people feel rejected, and both people feel unaccepted by their partner. You're in your spot, I'm in mine. That's it. And you're wrong, I'm right. You feel you're right or I'm wrong. And so I'm not hearing you. You're not listening to me. I feel no connection to you. I feel rejected. I feel criticized. And we're just stuck in gridlock. We can't move. We can't move forward. And we don't know what to do.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, how would you suggest starting to get out of that? I mean, is that the next point?
Yeah,
oh my God. But yeah, I mean, I would say that's really the crux of everything. Like, of course, you're going to have those smaller kind of conversations and arguments, but like, those are the perpetual problems. Yeah. Like, how you, like the tone that, you use, or like how you display affection or don't, or how you talk to other people, or, share these types of opinions. Like, those are the really tough things. And like you said, like belief system, like how are we operating as like people? And I do think that people who are very different can like live together and do well together, but you have to be able to be really open, be able to like really listen. And that can feel hard if somebody always feels criticized or judged, because then you're just going to shut down. So I think that it can work, but you have to have all these other things in line, which I think is probably why there's not as many people who do that, right? Because like most people would probably feel pretty shut down in that setting if there wasn't like a lot of that communication. But yeah, so when clients come to you with these problems, right, and these, kind of more perpetual issues, where would be the first place to start?
Listening. Start taking your ego out of the equation and stop thinking about it in terms of I'm right and she's wrong, or he's right and I'm wrong, or whatever the scenario plays out. And look to listen. And the only way to listen is the solution for gridlock is to have open dialogue. And so here's the other part that I want people to recognize is how many of you or how many people think that they're capable of change if they feel criticized and judged? So if you want to move your relationship out of gridlock, learning to accept the other individual for who they are and what they are or whatever their position is fundamentally important to breaking gridlock. You cannot change on any level if you feel criticized and judged. So you want to adopt a philosophy of total acceptance. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It just means I'm working to understand from your perspective what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what is happening, and why this is so important to you. I can't ask you to change. I can't expect change if I'm not willing to give you that. Why would you? All you're going to be is attacked. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to, now I'm either trying to be malicious in my intent and hurt you, or have no concern about fixing this argument. And that's a sign of gridlock. You have the same argument over and over again, or things get worse over time, right? You stay stuck in this pattern. It keeps coming up and it continues to get worse, and there's no solution to it. And we never do anything different. Well, you're both stuck in gridlock because you're not listening to each other. You're not having conversation about it. And you're not attempting to understand the person, and you're being judgmental. You're not accepting them. Mm-hmm. And so that's really the work. Acceptance is key for change. No one will change unless they feel accepted.
Yeah, and that opens up the door to then be like, hey, how are you feeling about this? Here's where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. This is what I meant. How did you take this? What did you mean?
Yes.
But like all of that literally does not matter unless you are willing to be open and actually listen. Mm-hmm. And I think that is just, would you say that it's probably harder as you've been in a relationship with someone for longer? Or do you think that it's more just kind of like where the individual, like as a couple, do you think it's more challenging the longer the people have been together? Or just in general, kind of where each individual person lies in terms of like openness and willingness to listen and all of that?
Where the person lies with their ability to...
Like you don't really see differences with length of relationship. It's more like the individuals.
Sure, you could pump out some statistics that say like within 1 to 2 years, there's a certain amount of arguments, mm-hmm. or this is pretty common.
Yeah, no, I don't care. I mean, like, what do you normally see?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the person's ability to sit in that and their ability to adopt those principles. I think it has less to do with time. I think obviously when you get to a significant period in time, like when we're talking like 10 plus years, mm-hmm. you have a really good understanding who this person is at that point. Right. And so it really comes down to behavior change. Mm-hmm. And can I accept this? And that can
be even harder, though, when you are with someone for a long time.
It can be, but, and your phase in life really determines a lot of this, too. Mm-hmm. You take two people who have been together for 10 or 15 years, and they're in their, like, 40s, 50s, or 60s. Mm-hmm. Very different couple than 10 to 15 years of 20s, 30s, or 20s mm-hmm. and 30s. You change so much in your 20s, your opinions, your views. Mm-hmm. They shift again in their 30s, mm-hmm. And then they shift again, usually moving into your 40s, because what you believed as a 20-year-old or how you acted and your views on the world, so many things, so much life happens mm-hmm. between 20 and 35. So much life that the decisions that you've made, the experiences that you've had, those all shaped you. And so it's normal for a person to change. And that's the problem. I fell in love with version A of you, this person who was, whatever, right? They had these qualities. Well, your life experiences maybe now have shaped, and you've taken new roles and perceptions, and things have been different. And a death occurred, a loss occurred, we've moved, we've had kids. There's all kinds of things that happen. And now you have a different set of values. And so my willingness to adopt and grow with you is going to be the best indication as to whether or not this relationship is going to last. And how we manage conflict is a small part of that, because how we connect and become friends and stay friends is more relevant to me than how we actually deal with conflict. Mm-hmm. So am I growing with you? Do we still have the friendship? Do we still have the camaraderie and the companionship that comes with it? Can we laugh? Can we have fun together? Can we do things? Because if all we're doing is just managing conflict and there's none of that, like, whoa, this is a rough relationship.
Yeah. I would say that probably does get harder as you've been with someone for a long time and you're also older, right? Because mm-hmm. things become a little bit more fixed. Mm-hmm. Things become a little bit, I would say, hectic in certain areas, but less hectic in others. Yes. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's just like a different dynamic, like as you're older. Mm-hmm. Presuming that you've been together for a while, not talking about people who are newly married when they're older, which also could be different too, because now you're just a little bit more of like a fixed kind of person. Mm-hmm. At that point, you probably know a little bit more kind of about yourself. Like, this is what I'm into. I'm probably going to be into this for most of the rest of my life. You know what I mean? Which would be obviously very different, 30 years before that. Maybe not. I don't know. I haven't really met anybody who's like, I'm the same person as I was when I was 20 as I am as I'm 60. Like, I haven't met anybody like that, but I'm sure they exist. So maybe I just haven't met them.
And that's common. I hear that in couples counseling, somebody would be like, well, this is who I was when they married me. It's like, yeah, and that's who they were when they married you too, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to change. They don't have the right to grow.
And they probably should, hopefully.
Well, and so it's like...
Or, in certain areas.
Yeah, and so the expectation is like, okay, you may have stayed the same, and if you're the exact same person, good for you, but this person has changed. And so you have a choice. You can stay firm in this belief like, well, this is who I am, and they need to conform. Well, now we're not really listening, are we? We're not working for a common ground. You're right, and you just want to be right, and it doesn't matter. And if you're okay with that person walking out or leaving you, then be right. But if you're looking to make the relationship change, regardless of your inability or lack of desire or innate experiences that didn't change you, this other person has. And so you can make the choice at that point to start to understand this person and develop that connection with them. And so as we kind of move into some of the more actionable steps, I just kind of want to review. When we're talking about an argument, right, what are the goals that we're trying to keep in mind here? So number one, we're trying to develop a better understanding of our partner, not necessarily determine who's right and who's wrong. We're working to assume that both realities are equally valid, right? Your perception and my perception, same. And we want to pay attention to what are some of the communication barriers that may exist that are preventing us from seeing these things. So let's kind of get into some of the step-by-step stuff that we can do. Number one, first and foremost, you need to listen, right? And so part of this means your ability to start to express how you're feeling and to say those things out loud. I felt defensive. I felt stupid. I felt unattracted. I felt disliked. I felt afraid. I felt unsafe. I felt is letting me know exactly what you're feeling, what's happening inside you so that I can understand it. If I don't know what you're feeling, you're leaving it up to me to guess. So I want you to help me with this. I'm not a mind reader, and I want everybody to get rid of this. Like, I hear this all the time too. I hear like, well, I just wish he would know. Well, he doesn't. He's not intuitive that way. He doesn't know. Maybe he doesn't give a shit. Maybe he doesn't. No one ever taught him. No one ever cared about this before. He doesn't know. So stop assuming that he does. And I want you to be very direct in telling him what you want, what your needs are, and what you're feeling. Tell him what you want. And I say him because I'm a guy, and this is primarily a complaint that I hear mostly from the women in the relationship. They're like, I wish he would know to do this. Why do I have to tell him to do this? I hear these things over and over again. It's like, stop assuming that he's going to know. He's not a mind reader. Treat him like an idiot. Okay? Assume he knows nothing and tell him everything he needs to know and do. Then you know 100% you've already explained it and there's nothing left for doubt or assumption. So I felt, and expressing your feelings is truly important for the other person to understand you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Step 2 would be understanding that each reality is equally valid. Okay. So step 1 is identifying what your feelings are. Step 2 is identifying that each reality is valid. Take turns describing your perceptions, your own reality, what happened to you within this particular argument or incident that occurred. The other person can work to summarize the other person by, kind of making sure summaries are really important sometimes because they help you understand whether or not you understand them and that you got it right. Okay. So if you're explaining something to me and I say, all right, what I'm hearing you say is this and this.
Got it.
I'm allowing you to say like, yes, you got it. Or no, this. Like, okay, fine. I'm not going to take that personal. And do your best to control your attitude in these moments, right? Because I'm trying to be understanding, and it's not going to help my case if you're like, no, that's not what I said. And I'm going to be like, okay. Like, now I'm starting to get angry because I'm feeling disrespected. Mm-hmm. Oh, there it comes. I feel great. And what was one of those categories? Feeling disrespected, right? Mm-hmm. So you start to see where this goes. It's less art and more science at this point if you can apply the principles, right? You don't have to feel your way through all of this. There's some steps here that you can take and kind of start to become transparent.
Yeah, and also starting to know, okay, like once you get better at this, you'll be able to recognize, all right, now I'm kind of past a point where maybe we're going to have a constructive argument, right? Like now, for whatever reason, something set me off so much that like, this is probably done for today, tonight, the next hour, whatever it is. But like you said, like, okay, now I'm getting kind of upset, right? And then like people also have to be like, that's the listening part too. Like if you're like, listen, I'm not going to be able to answer this right now, right? I think that's another thing. A lot of people, some people process things really quickly. They want an answer right now. They want to do, and then other people take a lot longer, or they're slower. They're like, okay, I need to gather all this information. I need to sit with how I'm feeling about this and then process it and move forward, which can also be like a point of contention for an argument. Like, I need to know this now. Why can't you answer this now? And I think a lot of times like that could be a source of just conflict in general, like people processing things differently. So I think recognizing that within yourself and being like, hey, listen, like I wasn't trying to not answer that earlier, but like this is going to take me some time to like sit and think on it, and then we can address it. And okay, I understand where you're at. Here's where I'm at. Okay, now we'll move forward.
Yes.
At a later date. And that's part of understanding that other person. And like maybe that'll change over time. You know, they could be a slow processor for a number of reasons. And then once they get more comfortable, okay, now I can kind of pick up the pace, right? So there's just so many reasons. Like I'm just thinking of so many different kind of arguments, right? Where someone will take it personally, and then like when you actually ask about it, the other person's like, no, this is what I meant. And you're like, well, then why the fuck would you say it that way? Like this was a horrible way to bring that up. And they're like, oh, sorry. And then, but you can genuinely tell, like this was a genuine response. Like you're really not like, you really didn't mean it that way. But like the way you said this was just, that was just not appropriate. Well, yeah. And that's learning, oh, sorry, like my bad. That's how I've always said things before. I didn't mean it that way. Or
right. And so there's an opportunity for you to start to use more empathic statements. Like, okay, I hear what you were saying, and I understand why now that would make you feel that way. Like, I get it. You felt judged. You felt not heard. You felt criticized, whatever it is. Like, I can see why that made you upset. Now I'm understanding you. I'm actually displaying empathy in the relationship. You know, and the third category to this is just kind of like, if you both understand, like, do you understand? Do I understand? Great. We can move on. If you don't understand or I don't, stay right here. This is where the work needs to be done to be able to understand each other. So until the both of you understand, stay in that space. Don't move on. Don't brush it under the rug and tell it's not important. I just want to stop arguing. Right? Okay, well, first of all, maybe we don't need to argue over this. Maybe we just need to hit pause, and so we can have a conversation about it later. Yeah. Right? And talk about this like adults.
Would you say that, like, so say somebody comes to you, obviously they're, you know, typically engaging in these kind of arguments, or they would be self-described having a lot of arguments in their relationship, especially these kind of perpetual ones. Would you say that it's better to do couples therapy or do separate therapy or both, right? Like, obviously I know it's going to depend on the individual and like the couple, but do you think that it's like this type of stuff always needs to be dealt with together, like in a couples therapy type setting, or have you worked with people individually and then that is just kind of sufficient?
I've worked with people individually and they bring this back to their couple, their relationship, and they work on it. I've also worked on it with couples in the room. I think that it's important for each person to understand these steps and to do the work for themselves. And if you're agreeing as a couple to come to couples counseling, then work on it as a couple. I don't necessarily like the whole, well, we're coming to you for couples counseling, but I'm going to, you know, do one session with her, one session with him, and then see you guys as a couple. Like, no. I had one experience where I had a couple who they both started with me as individuals. Like one person came to me, had a session, they're like, oh, I really like the therapist. And then the other person started to come. And so I was seeing them both as individuals. And then they both decided collectively that like, oh, we think we would benefit now. Like our individual work is done. We want to work on a couple. And so then they started coming to couples counseling. So slightly different dynamic, but they both had the same therapist from the very beginning. So you both need to be doing the work, and it can be done individually, and you can bring it into the relationship. Okay.
Yeah, I was just curious if you had seen like patterns, because I could imagine, and it's of course going to be client, like an individual difference. You know, like some people maybe aren't ready for couples counseling, you know what I mean? And that it might actually be more valid for just one person to kind of slowly start to work on these things versus being like, yep, I'm here.
The only
this
problem
is great. You know, like there's always going to be that, like there can be that couple, like, oh, I'm just here because I have to be, you know, like sick. This is going to be an awesome session. You sound really open to talk right now.
The only one of the hurdles to when it's just the individual and not the couple is if you're coming to therapy and you're getting therapy from your therapist and they're giving you these tools, The other person doesn't know this stuff. So it's incumbent upon you to relate it back and for them to buy into it as well, even if they're not in session. Right?
Yeah, I could see how that would be.
Yeah. Like, you're working on this shit with your therapist and I got to fucking change.
Yeah, perfect. Or
nailed it.
You could be like describing, you know, kind of how you see things, and then like had that story, the adage that you shared, like, you know, two people are sharing things, but like if the therapist can't see that, it can also be like, you know, the therapist is always hearing the one person's perspective, right? And then they're like, okay, well, I'm trying to help you here, but then, you know, they maybe see the couple together and they're like, oh, well, this is a totally different landscape. You know what I mean? Like how you're viewing things, like both things are right, certainly. Like you both have your reasons for believing this, but like this dynamic is very different now that I'm seeing it play out like together, right? Like I would imagine as a therapist, it would be very beneficial to kind of start to see maybe some of that bickering or some of that back and forth. Cause then you could be like, oh, yes. Okay, now I see I see, you know, when he does this happens, or when she does that, then this happens. And I could imagine that seeing that kind of in real time. Yeah,
it can, because you have the ability to start pointing things out that maybe they're not seeing.
They're not seeing because they're shut down.
You can be like, oh, hey, look at your wife. Look at her posture right now. What is that telling you? So you're drawing attention to their nonverbal cues, the nonverbal communication that they're expressing. Like, you know, or Cynthia, your husband just said this. Like, tell me what you think he's feeling right now. Tell me what's behind that. So you're getting her to be a little bit more empathetic by understanding what he's saying and what he's feeling. And so, yes, those arguments in the moment can have benefit to be like, okay, I can start to draw awareness to these things and help guide to create the healthier habits that you guys can use at home. Because therapy is like 1 hour a week mostly for most people. And then, you know, the idea is to develop the skills to use them in the relationship. And I think one of the other problems, and I hear this a lot, and I get this a lot, especially from guys, is everybody thinks that because they've been talking their whole life, that they know how to communicate. And me and my wife have been together for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. I don't need this therapy shit. Why do I got to change the way you want to change? Because clearly it's not working. You've been together for 20 years. And even if you're going to stay together for the rest of your life, do you want your other partner to be miserable? Because that's what they're telling you is happening. And if that doesn't matter to you, then it doesn't matter. And so go ahead. Think that you know everything. Assume that you're right and move on with your life, and just whatever happens, happens. But I think the idea of it is to recognize that just because you've been talking your whole life doesn't actually mean you know how to communicate with somebody. And there's things that we don't want to do that are required in these patterns in order to understand the person and actually resolve conflict or manage the conflict. Step 3 would be understanding triggers, right? Share what escalated the interaction between the two of you, right? This is kind of like, I felt judged, I felt criticized, I felt ashamed, I felt lonely, you know, you said this or this happened, and this is kind of how it started to escalate, or I didn't like being in this place with these people in this situation. And it starts to help you get a better understanding of like, this again is like, I can catch it before it becomes a problem rather than waiting. And so if you can understand, the more awareness you have into something, the more conscious you are of it, the more likely you are to catch it and interact with it in the moment, rather than it being like something that you're totally absent-minded about. Feels like it's coming out of left field. So you really want to work to avoid that. And validating your partner's triggers is really important. Don't minimize it. Don't criticize it.
Yeah, and that can be hard also in the moment of that argument too, you know, because that's like an easy thing to like throw in someone's face, you know. And then that's one of those things you're like, damn, I should not have said that.
Yes.
I'm a monster. But, and then apologizing, I don't know if that's a step or not, but I feel like that's a whole different podcast.
It can be. We've already done apologizing. Haven't we done a podcast?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Well, but
step 4. That is an actual thing too, because a lot of people don't know how to communicate, and a lot of people do not know how to apologize. It's like, I didn't mean that. You're like, oh, that was fucking really convincing. You should have Oscar for that.
Yes, there's sincere apologies, and then there's fuck off placating apologies.
It's like, do you know who Liver King is? Definitely not.
Yes. How do I not know who the Liver King is?
Oh, sorry. I've literally seen his page once, so I didn't even really know who this was.
He's just all over. Like, if you listen to the Rogan podcast, I can't stop talking about the guy.
I honestly stumbled upon him one time because everybody was talking about this. Was maybe months ago, I don't know, but that whole apology came out, and he was like, I take extreme ownership of my actions. And I'm like, dude, do you even know what extreme ownership means? Anyways, that was.
He saw the title on Jocko's book and decided.
Yeah, he was like, "This looks good." listen, for the record, I don't give two fucks if this person takes steroids. It's pretty obvious. It's just...
The real question is, do you think his abs are implants?
No.
I don't know. They don't move. He's the only guy I know that like can sit down slouched and has like rock hard, perfect abs. And I'm like, maybe there's something to that. Step 4.
If you saw this person in real life, you'd be like he would look a lot different. That's what I'm going to say.
Okay. Take responsibility. Mm-hmm. This is a really big fundamental step in any relationship. But when it comes from an authentic place.
Yes. Yes, the real kind, not the Liver King kind.
Yes. Understanding what your role was, what you did, how it affected the other person. These are really important things. So kind of like what set me up was I had been very stressed and irritable. I didn't express how much I appreciated towards you. I'd been turning away more. Right? I've been getting easily upset. I've been depressed. I statements are taking responsibility, right? I haven't been as affectionate. I haven't been as warm. I haven't been as welcoming. I haven't been making the effort. I haven't worked in our relationship. I've taken it for granted, right? This is what responsibility sounds like. And if you're saying it just to shine the other person on and end the relationship, well, guess what's going to happen? We're going to know, because this is going to turn into a perpetual problem that we're going to continue to argue about over and over again. And then you guys are going to end up breaking up or going to couples counseling. You know what I mean? And so taking responsibility is fundamentally one of the first things you can do for the other person to help eliminate the responsibility and the burden they feel for themselves too. It's the first thing you can do for somebody else. Believe it or not. This is a huge part of almost every level of treatment and therapy is taking responsibility and, stating specifically too what you regret and what you're sorry for. Saying the words, I'm sorry, just really doesn't do much. It's a vague blanket statement. I'm sorry for disrespecting you. I'm sorry for being overly critical. I'm sorry for whatever. I attacked you when I did this. I didn't listen to you when I said this. I'm sorry for not listening to you, whatever it is. Specifically state what you're sorry for. Understand how you can change that behavior moving forward. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then if you accept your partner's apology, then say so and let it be done. If you don't, then say that and figure out what needs to be done to get to that space.
Well, that's a good point, because I think a lot of people maybe would just kind of keep bringing, if it's done, then it's done. Then you got to move forward from it. You don't want to always be bringing that up. Oh, remember that one time? It's well, didn't we address this? We had this discussion. We came to a somewhat of a conclusion, whatever that is. That conclusion might not be agreeing, but we came to a conclusion. We took responsibility, and now we have to kind of close that book and move forward. Because you can always find something to nitpick in someone, but then that's no way to that's going to start another argument. Mm-hmm. You're always nitpicking me. You're always doing this. You have to sometimes be all right. And that's maybe putting that ego and that pride aside, because maybe you didn't win, air quotes, the argument. You have to be all right, here's your side. Here's my side. We took ownership here. Let's close it and move forward.
Yeah. And that kind of moves you into the final step of, step 5 would be making constructive plans. How do we create a strategy? What can we do differently to avoid this conflict next time? Share one thing that you can do to make the discussion better, etc. So make that plan and share when it's your turn. Work to make things better the next time. Mm-hmm. Be as agreeable as you can with your partner in that space, because you guys are working to compromise at this point in time, and you're working to understand each other and move on, and one thing that I do want to say, kind of bordering on that comment before we wrap up here, is you hear that a lot, we can't keep bringing up the past, but sometimes the past isn't the past. Even though something happened a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, for that person, for whatever reason, it's still very much alive in their mind. It's still as present today as it was 10 years ago. And so if it doesn't get dealt with, if you can't figure out ways to continue to bring it up in healthy spaces, I heard Esther Perel once talk about holding vigil for the relationship, right? If I've wronged you, it's almost my responsibility now to bring up what it is that I did. If I cheated, it's my responsibility to bring it up. Like, hey, how are you feeling about this? How are you feeling about my, this relationship or my coworkers or these things? I realize I broke that trust. So now I'm taking the responsibility off of you and I'm taking ownership for it. And I'm bringing what is this painful thing from our past, but I'm owning it. I'm keeping it present. I'm holding vigil for the relationship. I'm doing the work so that you don't always have to, so that I can acknowledge that space for you. Because for that person, even though it happened a long time ago and you're like, it's in the past, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is very much a part of that person's present space. And if you don't recognize that, and if you can't see that, and you can't protect the relationship, where are you going with this? And so this is a stumbling block that a lot of people fall into. It's like, well, we can't bring up the past. And you're right. You don't want to keep bringing it up.
I didn't mean for big things like that.
I know,
meant like we moved past this discussion. Like we don't need to like.
Did we find a solution to it?
Yes, that's what I meant.
Okay.
Like when we found the solution, not like a larger kind of situational thing.
Okay,
like that.
Yeah, fair enough.
Meant like, did we come to a conclusion here? Mm-hmm. There's no like conclusion to that situation, right? Like that's kind of a more ongoing thing. Mm-hmm. So I meant more like, okay, this is where we're both at.
If we agreed and we made the plan, we found the solution, put it to bed and move on. Like, let's go have fun now. Mm-hmm. Let's go be friends. Let's go do something. Let's, enjoy our relationship, because remember, the argument isn't supposed to be the most dominating thing in the relationship. We want the friendship. We want the relationship, the companionship, that to come forward. And don't lose sight of that. And I think one of the things that couples counselors do too much is they focus too much on this. And like when I say this, I mean conflict management and their arguments and their bitterness, rather than being like, tell me what the other person does that's really great, and what are you guys doing to celebrate those things? And if you highlight the strength base from that person, it comes from a different approach, and it's kind of like, okay, this argument isn't as big or as important as, weighing the balance of the relationship.
Mm-hmm. All right, so final thoughts on conflict management. If there was one key takeaway, I have my key takeaway from the podcast. So what do you go first?
Arguments are nothing more than discussions you guys can be having later. Both sides are equal and valid. There is no absolute truth. So sit down and listen to each other and put your feelings aside.
Yeah, I would say the listening is really the biggest component here that I've taken away from this. Every time we do these podcasts, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like so many people don't just get into relationships and do not think about these things at all.
No.
And maybe now that I'm getting older, I'm thinking about these things more. I don't know. But I don't think a lot of people go through these types of things like early on. And then what ends up happening is like later they have all these issues like down the line. And they're like, I really don't know how to argue. I really don't know how to communicate here. And it's like, because when you're first dating someone, you're not like, hey, so how do you want to argue about this? Like they're just
like, I swiped right on this person. I wonder how they deal with conflict.
Yeah.
No, you're just like, oh, they're hot. So yeah. You're not thinking in those terms, but you are, because your life experiences have happened. It's a new perspectives, new ideas.
Not gonna lie, I literally asked him like, okay, so maybe.
And just
maybe I shouldn't have done that. Anyways, the more that we do these, the more that I'm like, man, we just need to continue to do like some of like the relationship style podcasts, because I know that there are so many people. I mean, my clients talk about this kind of stuff with me, obviously in a much different level. But this, and friends too, like everybody has these kind of conflicts with relationship, struggle. So anyways, we're going to keep making this more of a part of the show, because it really is so important. We get so many questions about this and just kind of scenarios. So to wrap this up, if you guys have any questions for us specifically for this or really anything else, we will drop the link below in the show notes to submit your question there. It can be a topic or a specific scenario. Put Rick's contact information in the show notes as well. Just say your email out loud though. You can remember this time.
FullCircleTherapyFL@gmail.com.
Remember that one time I asked you and you were like, wait, what's my email? Okay. And you can also check out any of our coaching services at teamlocofit.com, or you can sign up for our app at redefinehealthyapp.com. So thank you guys so much for listening. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please share it, and we will talk to you next week.